Hey everyone, welcome back to the Well Aware Podcast. I'm your host, Conrad Ruiz, and today I'm with Rob Matzkin. I'm going to tell you a quick story about how I met with Rob, and then we're going to go ahead and formally get you connected with him. So Rob and I met through a David Holman, who, if you don't know who David is, chances are I don't even know where to begin. You kind of want to get immersed into this world of networking amongst people who obviously understand factors like, you know, what it means to know, like, and trust. What does it mean to, trust someone with your kids, no less? I think there's a lot to be said about where David's principles come from in terms of networking. But the reason I want to preface the relationship between Rob and David in terms of how Rob and I got connected is that I think getting to know someone like Rob just as a stranger, I think it would come to you as a surprise that he is this multi-successful entrepreneur, that he has a summit that he's currently running for folks who want to build and expand their businesses further. It doesn't seem likely. I mean, for those of you who know me, it doesn't seem likely that I'm just going to find myself amongst such an amazing character. And yet here we are. And so I want to share some appreciation to David first off, because without his community orchestrated connected, Rob and I wouldn't be here together. But with that introduction being said, please welcome Rob Matzkin. Rob, good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you too. You too, buddy. I'm great, man. It's really good being here, and thanks for having me.
Rob, there are birds chirping in the background. You've got a wonderful natural setting going on. Where are you?
I am in Bodrum, Turkey, which is, if I look out that way, there's a Greek island over there. So we're kind of where Turkey meets Greece, and it's just a gorgeous area where my girlfriend's parents currently reside. So here I am.
Fantastic. I can't say I'm jealous, but it is a dark and dreary day here in Sunnyside, Florida, which is just to say we're kind of getting prepared for hurricane season a little bit. Like, we've already gotten the kind of news about, like, hey, everyone, start, ravaging your local CVS for supplies, because, we never know when doomsday is going to come. I never really understood that whole thought process, but I do know it's smart to prepare. So it's such a weird, because you and I met here in person, here in Florida. So.
Well, that's right. I live on Miami Beach. I live on 26. So yeah, but all my kite surfing friends are having a great time today. So I don't know what you're complaining about.
That, I think, we'll take on as a lesson in perspective. Rob, I want to let the audience know more about you and just who you are as an individual, as a professional. And what I think we could do to kind of get that started is, I think it would be great if you could share with us a little bit of the history of your world of work as a professional.
Yeah. So my history of work as a professional, long story short, have about a career that spanned about 20 years now. Gosh, that's scary to say. Always been an entrepreneur. I built quite a few different businesses and destroyed most of those businesses and destroyed most of those with my ego, I guess, is if I really look at it. But I've also had a few wins as well and a few successful exits. Nothing in the insanity range, but definitely had some nice wins. And, for me, I've always been in tech, in startups, and always kind of on the business side of things. I'm never the guy that's programming or the guy that's programming. I'm the one that's actually building out the revenue of the company, the business strategy, the CEO, COO, really CRO is, I think, the role we've determined the last 5 years is what I really do, is really chief of revenue. So that's me. I've done startups everywhere from Vail, Colorado, in the travel and hospitality space, to New York City, inventing alcohol delivery with cruise carriage, all the way to Tel Aviv, Israel, where we're doing education technology, and we're doing enterprise knowledge management using AI in 2018. And I've done quite a few things in between. These days in Miami Beach, I really focus on performance of entrepreneurs, right? So consulting / coaching, it's leveraging my 20 years of business to really make sure my clients that I consult are really performing, whether that's product market fit, Series Seed or Series A, and really how they're raising money, how they're performing with the team, how they're leading, how they're communicating. All these things is what I touch upon, but really what it comes down to is how do we make sure that the companies are growing and thriving is really what I focus on these days. And then bringing it to my real thing that I'm most passionate about these days is Bond Summit, where we really bring together top visionaries from across the world that, we have people that are running family offices, unicorn founders, professional athletes, comedians, artists, all coming together on people actually, from NGOs as well, but all coming together to really work on their vision of how they impact the world and be heart centric, really on trust and authenticity. And then there's quite a few other projects that I work on these days as well, whether that's as an investor, an equity-based shareholder, or advisor. So my world is pretty diverse, but it's always around startups building amazing things, working with amazing people. So, yeah.
Never a dull hour.
Probably not.
Rob, when we first spoke about putting this podcast episode together, I brought up a very particular topic of interest. And I think this came about as a result of you sharing a little bit about the Bond Summit and what you're working on, and also just through your years of experience. I mean, you highlighted yourself that, you've had successes, but you also had failures in the realm of business. And whether ego or not be involved, I'm curious if you could open up the conversation with me around what is the operation of trust? I mean, you mentioned trust at one point during your introduction about how involved you were with the world of growth and whether or not a company is successful and thriving. And I think a lot of that can be tied to, well, is a company operating to scale successfully? But in order for us to do that with peace of mind, we have to trust that the system is operating accordingly. I mean, sometimes we can't, I think this is the lesson that I talk about in the realm of time management, which is that you can't be everywhere all at once. And so some of the things that you sort of sit and put together to sort of stand on their own, you have to trust that that system will maintain itself, as far as I understand it. What's your understanding of trust as an operation, and how does it impact the world of work that you see in the businesses that you're integrated with on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so let's just zoom out real quick, right? So if we look at trust as a fundamental piece of business, and when it's in place, everything really runs smoothly. And when it's not, that's when we tend to pull our hair out, and that's when we really tend to get overwhelmed, right? So, and what do I mean by that? Let's zoom out all the way to investing, right? When I invest, what are the core principles that I look for? One, well, is it a valid idea, right? And do I like the idea? And it's all that. But really, the founder, are they going to be able to execute on the idea? Do I trust that they could execute on the idea? Do I trust them to be a fiduciary and responsible with my money? All comes down to trust, right? So now we start drilling down, right? We're working with our team. Or we're working with our co-founder, right? Do I give them access to the bank account or not? Do I trust them? Maybe not, right? Or maybe trust and verify, right? Do I trust them to do what they said they're going to do? Because if I don't trust them to do what they said they're going to do, I have to manage them. And then we can't lead if we're managing. All the way going down to our employees. If we trust our employees to do what they say they're going to do and do it at the level we expect them to do, our lives are really easy. We could get to lead versus manage versus micromanage. Our vendors, our systems. If we trust our vendors to do what they say they're going to do, well then, and our systems to scale the way they need to scale and do those things and actions, well, we could sleep easy at night, knowing things aren't going to break, or trusting things aren't going to break, trusting our vendors to do their jobs. Now, unfortunately, I just covered a huge range of most of the business. And how often does that all happen, right? Things break, employees don't do what they're going to say, business partners do things that, could trigger us, right? Our vendors don't do what they say they're going to do, overcharges, don't deliver on time, whatever that might be. But when you could actually establish ways of operations and working and communicating, if there's just trust, that's when you go from working in the business to working on the business. And if you actually want to lead your company and grow your company, there's no way that you could work in the business, manage the business, and work on the business. Now that's Michael Gerber 101 E-Myth Revisited, right? I didn't make that up. Gerber came up with that 35 years ago and changed the fundamentals of business. But really, it does come down to that fundamental principle.
I sense that trust operates both as a security protocol, because when you brought up that point about how, I'm making decisions around letting a co-founder have access to the business bank account. And this can be based on someone who I could, and I always like to do this with my team as well. Like I give my team access to my email address and my email account, but that email account is actually separated from, how I like to see it as an externally facing email address, which definitely has still its compromises of security, right? Like trust could be broken and things could be done in a very nefarious way for me, even if it's not by my own team. Like I always like to say, it's not my team that I'm worried about, but rather the person who could hack my team or get socially engineer their way into my team that I could be potentially concerned about. But even then, I would say, there's my cruiz at wellaware.me email address, and there's my admin account. And my admin account is the one that holds all the financially sensitive, logins and other types of things.
And by the way, I have people that have access to my email, but in all the banking, whether it's usually it's always a different email, like you said, but you always have two-factor authentication on as well, right?
Right.
So,
right.
But moving away from the finances, and you need to trust your partner to be a fiduciary with you, right? But think about trust like this. It's like, if you really want to lead, you have to trust your team to manage their own people, to manage their own time, their own responsibilities. And it depends who you want to be, right? You could hire individuals that aren't capable of managing themselves, and you have to micromanage them. But then you're also in an environment that is short on trust and lacking of trust, which is fine. I have found it to be way easier, way less stressful when you put when you operationalize trust. Right? Trust doesn't mean blindly like turning your back and looking up in 6 months and being like, oh, I think they did it. Trust but verify. You can still check up on them, but you don't necessarily have to micromanage anything.
You don't have to spend your time on a one-to-one standard with somebody else to make sure that things are getting done accordingly. I mean, there are certain cases where one could say, well, I'm investing a one-to-one relationship of time with this other person because we're operating together on making something happen. But then to your point, I need to leverage my other ratios of time to trust with some other parties to 1 to 2, 1 to 10, 1 to 100.
I'm not saying spend less time with employees, actually, but the time you spend with them won't be on verifying that they did their job. It'll be how could they execute better at their job? How could you improve that department? How could you improve what they're working on? Not did they do their job, right? I was listening to somebody rant on Instagram, and they were like, if I have to put in place, you shouldn't be on Netflix, you shouldn't be on Insta, you shouldn't be doing this, you shouldn't be doing that while you're at work. I hired the wrong person. If I have to communicate that, if you think that's acceptable. So it goes to, trust. If that's the frame we're looking at, right? And looking through.
How do you feel about companies that in that topic of interest, right, where you have a person who's clearly salaried, right? And within that salaried expectation, they are committing certain hours throughout the day to perform. And your expectation obviously is that because you're paying them to be available during that point in time, you want that time to be both productive and meaningful to the nature of what you guys are working on and what that person is inherently paid to do. And conversely, you don't want them, just milking that money, if you will, or milking that time, doing something that's completely unrelated to business, whether it's purely for recreation or, for some folks, it could be they're productive, but they're being productive elsewhere, not towards the goals of what they're being hired for.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
When it comes to that type of trust, again, you bring up the verification process. I find it very both interesting and a bit almost dystopic when companies have to, put mouse trackers on to see if you're active on the screen. I understand putting blockers inside of internal company accesses where it's like you couldn't even access Netflix if you tried because you're on a company server and that computer just simply doesn't allow you to access those applications or websites because they've been specifically blocked. So it's not, you can't even perform the behavior even if you tried unless you went onto a personal device. But where does that component of trust fall in line from an operations standpoint? Again, you brought up it's who we hire that ultimately makes sense. But, even a good potential hire in the beginning may just not be a fit. Do you just have to kind of, roll with those punches and say, well, it turns out this was, a false fit. We just need to go find someone else, right?
So,
Don't get into sunken cost.
Well, there's a few things. One, I want to clarify something you said a minute ago. And really, when I don't love paying people by the hour, I love paying salary or outcome driven work, right? If I'm working with consultants, this is what I'm paying you for to finish this outcome, right? If I'm working with employees, let's work on salaries and let's create an outcome that we want to do every week, right? And let's have KPIs drive that. So quite frankly, if you want to take a break in the middle of the day, by the way, I nap every day. I take a 15-minute nap in the middle of the day. Even if I'm in an office, I will go on a couch in the middle of everybody. I've done this in the past, and I will take a nap. Why? Because I feel that I'm way more productive through the second half of the day, and I'll get twice as much done. So I'm unabashed about that, right? It's not about how we spend our time. And if you're like, I want to be on Instagram for 15 minutes because I have a break, fine, go for it. That's not my point. Right? My point is, how can you really make sure your employees are executing on what they need to accomplish and setting up an operation such that you could track that and implement that, right? And when you're working with somebody like yourself, it's like, how do you implement teams that really get that? Again, not tracking hours, but tracking outcomes. Now, sorry, I went on my own tangent. Your question around, just re-ask your question one more time for me so I get it straight.
This was about to your point, like almost like blocking the distractions or almost like big brothering different relationships in teams. Like, where did that, like, what happened to trust in those particular arenas?
I mean, if you have to do that as a small business, I really worked very little for corporates in my career. I've worked either created or been with companies that are like 100 people or less, right? And so I can't comment to big corporations, but I get why they do that. But I actually think your question was really on hiring. And if you're a month in, how long, or the question is, how long do you bite the bullet on employee and trust your initial decision versus move on? Right? That was the question, if I'm not mistaken.
When do you call it quits on a provider who doesn't seem to be providing or is providing below expectations?
So I think I've had a few conversations with a few different clients, actually coincidentally last 2 weeks around this, right? And with one client, we were talking, that person, he just didn't have the right individuals on the bus. And he was going nuts on how is he doing things wrong, when in fact it was just the wrong people. And they have been with the company for years, but they're the wrong people for his management style. So they're unworkable for the way he needed to lead. So what we're concluded is, well, maybe in some circumstances, they either need to shift positions or ship out. Now, the name escapes me of this individual. He's the founder of Wix, and he has a quote, and I thought it was extreme, and now I'm coming around to it, that if you interview a person a month in and wouldn't hire them on the spot again a month into them being with you, let them go.
Why did you think of that as an extreme, and now that why are you coming back around to it now?
Because it is an extreme thing. It's like you're just going to let somebody go like that in one conversation. It's very precise. It's very exact, right? And I'm like, okay. And now I'm like, well, wait a second. If you know that person really, really well now, and the other part of it too is like you have invested interest in it, you have sunk costs in it, spent all this time training, you turned off all the leads, you have to start over. It might take you another 6 months to hire them. You need that position, you need that work done. Like, oh my God, it's overwhelming. Like, and you know, and they're almost good enough, and they're like 75% of what you need, and right. But if you wouldn't hire them in that moment, cut them. And I think it's wise. You know, that could be a service provider, that could be an employee. Right? But, you know, if you think about it like this too, with all the nonsense that I just mentioned, with all your concerns and considerations, you know that person you're hiring because you're rehiring them after a month. You know that person perfectly and intimately. So you have all the knowledge you need to make that hire. And if you can't, they're not the right person. And you're just rationalizing and making up excuses. And they're probably never going to be the right person. And then you're hiring a B player for your organization, which you'll never be able to trust a B player.
Right. And you only increase your sunken cost fallacy further. You you start to erode your own integrity because you start to your point, like rationalization is just another way of saying, you're excusing yourself for not looking at the truth.
And then every other employee is going to look at that person and go, they're not up to snuff. That's the new benchmark. Or they're going to be just plain old dragging other employees down.
Right. They're reducing the efficiency of everybody else. Okay. Rob, based on this understanding around trust as a principle, what other ways do you see people in your world of work? Where do we need to operate more effectively? I mean, I love this idea of the Wix founder saying, you've got a 30-day window. Once you know what you know, reevaluate everything you've made a decision and decide right then and there if you need to start over again, regardless of what it costs. Because it's always going to be a long-term cost that's going to outweigh whatever the short-term costs are of starting over. What other sort of operational sort of principles workflows would you think people need to consider more within this realm of trust?
That is too broad of a question for me to answer.
Let's put another example on the table. I have, how do you feel? We talked a lot about the providers and employee side. What about on the client end or about the partner end? Partners, I think, are a little bit more like providers, but they also sort of mix in as clients because there's a unique relationship dynamic there. But what about clients? What's the trust per component for clients? I've seen all too many times providers giving way too much power in a relationship and not invoicing or not contracting people right away. And to me, it goes back to this conversation of trust. Like, do you trust your clients to pay you? Do they trust you to provide to them? Where is this conversion going on that some people just say, hey, I'm going to go into a relationship and I'll give them value and I expect them to give it back to me. But without these sort of safety nets, I've seen all sorts of people get screwed over. And I think it comes back down to, like, you never trusted them to begin with. And I think neither did they. What's your tale on that from a client perspective?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a service provider, I get sucked into this too. It's like, hey, I always bill the month before. I don't bill after my work. I bill before my work. And, the few times I let people, I shouldn't say this, 10% of the time I let people slide and they're like, okay, they move on, they cancel their contract early, they end up owing me money and I'm chasing money down for what? Because they didn't trust, and I had one person, they're like, it was a consulting client and I charge a monthly retainer and, long story short, they're like invented that there's 5 weeks every month. And that since and somehow rationalized that they didn't need to pay me for like a month of work because we only did 4 weeks. It was like the most ridiculous thing, making things up to invent that they did 5 weeks instead of 4, without getting into the specifics of it. But it's important that you have contracts in place and your proper paperwork in place, that, people pay you at least 50% before you do services, right? I think are some good rules of thumb, depending, service providers, it's a wide range, but, having paperwork in place, having agreements in place, getting paid at least some sort of value up front and, or provide, something that's equitable for both sides, but pre-agreed upon. And when people step over that, don't, I ran into it right now. If there's somebody who came to a summit and hasn't fully paid for their ticket or hasn't paid at all, they said they'd pay me 3 days later. It's been a few weeks now, and it's becoming problematic, especially when you allocate funds, or you prepay for them and you have hard costs associated with them. So but it comes down that, there's a line between, if you set up proper operations and systems, it's very easy to have trust because it's very clear what happens when you break it. Right? That's what paperwork is for, is when trust is broken. But if you don't have that, it becomes problematic.
Right, because there's the ability to break rules without any of the consequences, even in the best of intentions. Yeah. I really love the phrase from the U.S. Marines, "In God we trust, and all others we track." And I always try to sort of slightly quote around that and just say, "In all others we contract," just because I think it's the one way I can kind of highlight, like, I think a contract by design is meant to hold people accountable from a tracking perspective. Obviously, there is an operation of tracking whether or not a contract has been breached. But in the case of finances, let's say if someone doesn't pay you within net 14 days or so, or whatever, then that clearly showcases a breach of contract, and there's clear consequences established for like what happens when someone doesn't follow by those rules. That's kind of where I like that use of the quote. Where I'm grateful that you brought up that on the client facing side, or in any business dealing, right? If you can come in halfway, if there's a deposit process enabled, like, because I think everyone at the end of the day has to take a bit of a leap of faith in the realm of trust, right? Everyone has to trust your previous experiences, the people who recommended you and referred you. In the world of introductions, we always operate on this sense of trust that, like, if I can trust this, like, again, going back to David Homan's, principles of networking, if I can trust you with my kids, that's how I'm going to know if I should be able to connect you with people in my network. Where when trust gets broken, again, going back to this operational principle, do you feel that when you're someone who's dealt with a lot of trust breaking in the past, do your choices become a lot more restrictive? Like, I think again, another phrase goes, trust is built over years but broken in seconds, right? Does that apply from a perspective of, if you're someone who has a lot of experience and you're someone who has seen a lot of trust breaking behavior, do you now have a very short leash with people, or like what's your behavior now with new relationships, or like what's your relationship with new operations of trust going forward now that you have a lot of experience and have seen a lot of terrible things potentially?
Yeah, I mean, I inherently trust people, but I'll put things in place that I'll be listening for consistently if they're trusting people, right? Like, I don't want my past coming into my future relationships, right? That's going to impede it's going to impede success, right? Especially if somebody's worthy of my trust, right? Now, I won't just do a fall back exercise and be like, oh, I'm going to blindly trust this person, right? Trust is earned, right? And at the same time, I'm going to give somebody the respect that they deserve in the matter of trust. That they're going to have to prove to me that they're worth my trust. Now, there's many ways of doing that. Coming in from David Homan, right? There's a level of trust that we have, and I'm like, okay, great. And having referrals, okay, great. Now I could trust that person. That's not everything, but I could give my trust to that person and to still continue to listen, not judge, but listen. Yeah.
I think there are layers of trust, right? And I think one can continue to go up the rungs of how far I can go to trust someone. From I trust you to handle certain responsibilities, to I trust you to have access to certain things that can be potentially compromising. I trust you to be secure in managing those things, so that's not even just you're not even just looking out for yourself and your own worst behaviors, but someone else's potential nefarious deeds. Like, again, I alluded a little bit to, like, what happens if my team gets socially engineered, and someone decides to get through to them in a way to get to me, or the business that we're working on together. Rob, based on your current work with Summit, what's sort of your biggest takeaway on trust as an operation or trust as a process? What's
Yeah.
sort of
So
your big, yeah,
yeah. So we're Bond Summit, not Summit. Just want to make that distinction.
thank you.
Not just because there is a summit. So I just want to be precise with that. But what's my biggest takeaway? Building out Bond Summit. We didn't go in from the very beginning saying this is a community based on trust and authenticity. It showed up the first time we did it, and we're like, oh my God. When we put the right people in a room, what really happens is based on trust and authenticity. And when you have trust, people can be authentic and real, what their real challenges are, what's really in their way, what they really need help on. No matter how successful they are, if they're growing and they're a visionary, they're going to have challenges. But very few people trust others enough to share. The most successful people I meet all around the world, which this year I was fortunate enough to go to some of the most exclusive rooms that I never thought I'd be in. But the people, and I really have conversations with them, they go, Rob, I don't network much. I don't go out much. In fact, the people I do know, I'm scaling back and cutting them out because there's only 3 or 4 people that I trust anyway, and to do anything with. And if that's the case, then what am I spending time with anybody else for? So, and that's what I keep hearing again and again. So at Bond Summit, it's all about how do we bring together a significant amount of people, not significant, I should say, eventually 100 people in multiple communities to just trust each other and see what happens then when we really could transform what they're doing. That's what it's all about.
Rob, where can people go to learn more about you, to learn more about Bond Summit? What's the best way to contact you to inquire further about getting connected or getting to know more about your world of work?
Yeah, so the best way to contact me is my name at Gmail, robmatzkin@gmail.com. Also Rob Matzkin on LinkedIn, Rob Matzkin on Insta. Yeah, so just hit me up and that's my email, that's my website as well. But always happy to talk to anybody, not only around trust, but around business growth, around being a visionary. You know, Conrad, my number one ethos that fulfills me is how do I make a positive impact on other people's lives? Whether that's the right connection, the right piece of advice, the right piece of coaching, how do I make that impact? So happy to help.
Rob, I really appreciate the time today.
Anytime. Thanks so much.